The American soldiers expected rot, filth, and death. They had already seen too much of that at Buchenwald. What they did not expect was the bedroom. It was April 1945. The camp had fallen. The SS had fled or been captured, and the gates of Buchenwald, once sealed with fear, stood open under the boots of U.S. Army troops. Outside, the evidence of mass suffering was overwhelming. Skeletal survivors, piles of ash, barracks soaked in silence and grief. The soldiers moved through the camp with hardened faces, men who had marched through Europe and seen battlefields turn to mud and bone. Then they were led uphill, away from the barracks, toward a villa. It looked almost peaceful. The house stood apart from the camp, surrounded by trees, clean paths, and open air. Birds still sang there. The walls were intact. Curtains hung neatly in the windows. This was not the architecture of desperation. It was comfort, privacy, even luxury. This was the home of Ilse Koch. Inside, the soldiers moved carefully, weapons ready. They had already heard the whispers from survivors. A woman who rode through the camp on horseback. A woman who laughed. A woman who punished for pleasure. The inmates had a name for her, one spoken with fear and disbelief. The Witch of Buchenwald. The first room seemed ordinary. Tasteful furniture. Shelves. Decorative objects collected over years. But there was a feeling, something wrong beneath the normalcy. A silence that pressed in on the men as they advanced deeper into the house. Then one soldier opened the bedroom door. What lay inside did not scream. It did not bleed. It did not move. And yet, several men froze where they stood. The bed was neatly made. The wardrobe stood open. Lamps rested on polished tables. But scattered among the personal items, arranged with casual intimacy, were objects that did not belong to any normal human life. Souvenirs. Not taken from cities. Not stolen from enemies. Taken from people who never left the camp alive. The soldiers began to understand that this room was not just a place of rest. It was a trophy room, a private archive of cruelty kept steps away from mass death. Some of the men turned away immediately. Others stared, struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with the idea of a human being who slept here each night. One soldier reportedly muttered that the battlefield no longer felt like the worst place he had been. Because battle had rules. This did not. In that bedroom, the distance between civilization and savagery collapsed entirely. The line separating domestic life from industrial murder disappeared. The room told a story that the camp itself could not. A story of how evil did not always wear uniforms or shout orders. Sometimes it brushed its hair before bed. What American soldiers discovered there would become one of the most disturbing symbols of the Holocaust. Not because it was loud or violent, but because it was quiet, deliberate, and personal. And once the door had been opened, there was no closing it again. The soldiers did not rush through the bedroom. They couldn't. Combat had trained them to react fast, to noise, to movement, to threat. But this room demanded something else. Stillness. Processing. A slow realization that what they were looking at was not evidence of a single crime, but of a pattern. One man stepped forward and opened the wardrobe fully. Inside hung neatly pressed dresses, coats trimmed with fur, fine shoes lined in pairs. Nothing about them suggested war. They belonged to a woman who had lived comfortably, even elegantly, while thousands starved just beyond the hill. As drawers were pulled open, the tone of the room shifted. Personal items lay scattered among the clothing, small, carefully stored objects that made no sense at first glance. Pieces of parchment-like material. Book covers with an unnatural texture. Lampshades that seemed too smooth, too thin. Then someone said it out loud. "This isn't leather." The realization moved through the room like a shockwave. The soldiers had already heard rumors from liberated prisoners. Whispers spoken with hesitation, as if saying the words might summon something back into existence. Stories about human skin. About selections. About a commandant's wife who watched prisoners closely, not as people but as materials. Now they were standing in the place where those rumors had come to rest. One soldier reached toward a lampshade, then stopped himself. Another carefully lifted an album from the bedside table. Its cover was pale, stretched tight, faintly freckled. The binding was hand-stitched. No one spoke for several seconds. These were not battlefield trophies. They were domestic objects, items meant to be touched daily, incorporated into routine life. Whoever owned them had not hidden them away in secret compartments. They were displayed openly, used casually. That detail disturbed the men more than anything else, because it suggested pride. An officer ordered the room secured. Photographers were called in. Everything was documented exactly as it was found. The soldiers knew, instinctively, that what lay before them would one day need to speak for itself, when disbelief inevitably followed. As the inventory grew, so did the weight of the discovery. Book covers, gloves, decorative items, all believed to be made from the skin of murdered prisoners. Some of the items bore tattoos, faded numbers, small symbols, markings that confirmed what they had once been, living human beings catalogued by the camp, then reduced to objects for someone else's comfort. The men had walked through mass graves that same week. They had smelled the crematoria. They had seen bodies stacked like cordwood. But this felt different. This was intimate. The bedroom revealed not just killing but consumption. Not just death but transformation. People turned into possessions, absorbed into the private life of someone who slept peacefully at night. And the name tied to that life was already infamous. Ilse Koch was not an anonymous guard. She was the wife of Karl Koch, the commandant of Buchenwald. She lived above the camp like a queen overlooking her domain. Prisoners saw her daily, riding horseback, dressed well, accompanied by dogs. She did not need to be there. She chose to be. Survivors later told investigators that she carried a riding crop, not for control but for cruelty. That she selected prisoners personally, lingering over bodies, paying attention to tattoos. That punishment followed her gaze. At the time, the soldiers could not confirm every detail. But standing in that bedroom, surrounded by evidence that defied ordinary cruelty, they understood one thing clearly. This was not the work of rumor alone. It was the residue of obsession. The house itself became a crime scene. Every room was searched. But the bedroom remained the epicenter, the place where ideology and private desire merged. Where mass murder crossed into something darker, more personal. One soldier later said the room felt lived in by something that looked human but wasn't. Outside, liberated prisoners waited, watching the hill silently. Many already knew what would be found inside. They had carried the knowledge for years, unable to prove it, unsure if anyone would ever believe them. Now the door had been opened, and belief was unavoidable. As the investigation expanded beyond the bedroom, the soldiers began to understand that what they had uncovered was not an isolated horror, but a thread woven through daily life at Buchenwald. The villa was close enough to the camp that the sounds carried, whistles, shouted orders, the barking of dogs, sometimes screams. This was not separation. It was proximity. Survivors were brought forward to give statements. Many were weak, some barely able to stand, but when asked about Ilse Koch, their voices steadied. Fear had shaped their silence for years. Now, with the SS gone and American uniforms in the camp, words finally surfaced. They described how she appeared without warning, often on horseback, surveying the prisoners during roll call or work details. She was well-dressed, confident, visibly at ease. Unlike many guards who kept emotional distance, she watched closely, too closely. Several former prisoners told investigators the same thing independently. Men with distinctive tattoos were singled out. They would be transferred to infirmaries or workshops. Sometimes they disappeared within days. Sometimes their bodies were later seen, stripped of skin. At first, American officers struggled to accept this. The scale of killing at the camps was already staggering. Adding another layer of brutality seemed almost unnecessary. But the physical evidence from the bedroom forced them to listen differently. One former inmate, a Polish political prisoner, described being ordered to transport bodies from the pathology room. He recalled seeing pieces of skin stretched and treated, laid out like material. Tattoos were preserved. Numbers remained visible. He said the staff knew where those pieces were going. Up the hill. Investigators learned that Ilse Koch frequently visited the camp's medical facilities. While official records framed these visits as inspections, witnesses described her behavior as selective and deliberate. She asked questions. She made requests. She returned repeatedly. The bedroom artifacts now appeared less like grotesque curiosities and more like the final step in a process that had begun in full view of the camp. The soldiers returned to the bedroom with this new context. What had first seemed shocking now felt methodical. The objects were not random. They reflected taste choices. A preference for certain textures, markings, finishes. This wasn't madness. It was intention. Photographs taken by U.S. Army personnel would later circulate during war crimes investigations. The images were clinical, almost restrained. No dramatic angles. No commentary. Just objects placed on tables, catalog numbers attached. That restraint made them more powerful. Because they showed that evil did not require chaos. It could operate neatly, efficiently, behind closed doors. As word of the discovery spread through the camp, survivors reacted in different ways. Some wept openly. Others turned away, unwilling to relive memories they had buried for survival. A few nodded silently as if confirmation brought no relief, only exhaustion. They had known. What hurt was that knowing had never been enough. Ilse Koch herself was no longer at the villa. She had been arrested earlier by American forces. When confronted with accusations, she denied them calmly. She dismissed survivor testimonies as lies. She claimed the objects found were planted or misunderstood. To the soldiers who had stood in her bedroom, these denials felt hollow. They had seen how the room was arranged, how the objects fit naturally among personal belongings, how nothing suggested haste or concealment. This was not the aftermath of panic. It was the residue of normal life. The investigators began to realize something unsettling. Ilse Koch did not see herself as a monster. She had lived this life openly, comfortably, convinced of her position and entitlement. The bedroom was not a secret chamber. It was simply hers. And that realization shifted the tone of the entire case. This was not about a single sadistic individual detached from the system. It was about how the system allowed, enabled, and protected people like her. How ideology gave permission. How power erased accountability. The bedroom became a symbol, not just of cruelty but of normalization. The soldiers who discovered it would later say that moment changed how they understood the war. Before, the enemy had been armies, strategies, uniforms. After Buchenwald, the enemy had a face that smiled, decorated its home, and slept soundly at night. The investigation continued, reaching beyond the villa, beyond Ilse Koch herself. But everything traced back to that room, the place where suffering was no longer abstract, no longer industrial. It was personal. When Ilse Koch was brought before interrogators, the contrast between accusation and appearance unsettled everyone in the room. She did not look like the figure described by survivors. She was composed, articulate, and carried herself with an air of grievance rather than guilt. To her, the arrest was an insult, a misunderstanding, an injustice inflicted by victors eager to assign blame. She denied everything. The items discovered in the bedroom, she claimed, were fabrications. Some, she said, were made of animal material. Others, she suggested, had been planted by enemies or misunderstood by ignorant soldiers unfamiliar with luxury goods. The survivor testimonies, she insisted, were exaggerations born of resentment. But the physical evidence refused to cooperate with her narrative. Experts were consulted. Pathologists examined the materials. The conclusions were cautious but devastating. Several items were, beyond reasonable doubt, made from human skin. Tattoos were not decorative imitations. They were authentic. Identifiers from the camp system, numbers, symbols, remained visible. The bedroom had spoken. When news of the discovery reached the outside world, disbelief followed almost immediately. Newspapers struggled to frame the story. Editors worried that readers would dismiss it as propaganda. The idea that a person could transform murdered prisoners into household objects felt too extreme, too grotesque to be real. Yet photographs existed. Testimonies accumulated. Military reports aligned. The story refused to disappear. At the Dachau trials, where Ilse Koch was eventually prosecuted by American authorities, the bedroom evidence became central, not because of its quantity but because of its symbolism. Prosecutors argued that it demonstrated intent, participation, and moral agency. This was not passive association with a criminal regime. It was active, enthusiastic involvement. Survivors testified again now before judges. Many had never spoken publicly about their experiences. Some struggled to finish sentences. Others delivered their accounts with chilling clarity. They described being watched, selected, removed. They described the fear of being noticed. The defense attempted to dismantle these testimonies piece by piece. Memory was unreliable, they argued. Trauma distorted perception. No written orders existed tying Ilse Koch directly to the killings. But the bedroom required no orders. It showed outcome. The tribunal found her guilty. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. For a moment, it seemed as though the justice the survivors had waited for might finally hold. But history did not end there. Political pressure mounted. Doubts were raised. Some American officials began questioning the strength of the evidence, particularly as public skepticism persisted. The very extremity of the crimes worked against belief. Could a woman truly have done this? Could the stories be exaggerated? In 1948, Ilse Koch's sentence was commuted. The backlash was immediate and furious. Survivors felt betrayed. Journalists demanded answers. Protest erupted across occupied Germany and beyond. The bedroom, once again, returned to public discussion. Photographs were republished. Evidence was re-examined. What had been questioned was now reasserted. German authorities reopened the case. This time the trial took place under German jurisdiction. The evidence was narrower. The scope more limited. The horrors of the bedroom were harder to address directly. Yet even within those constraints, Ilse Koch was convicted again, this time sentenced to life imprisonment under German law. She would never return to the villa. The bedroom remained empty, but its contents lived on, in archives, in photographs, in survivor memory. Over time, the objects themselves disappeared, destroyed or sealed away, deemed too disturbing for public display. What remained was the story. And that story continued to haunt those who had opened the door. Many of the American soldiers involved rarely spoke about Buchenwald afterward. When they did, they often described the camp itself, the starvation, the dead, the silence. But some said the bedroom stayed with them longer, because it challenged something deeper. It forced them to confront the idea that evil did not always announce itself with violence, that it could coexist with routine, comfort, and aesthetic taste, that someone could drink coffee in the morning, oversee suffering in the afternoon, and sleep among trophies taken from the dead. The bedroom showed what happened when ideology erased humanity completely, not just in victims but in perpetrators. It was not a crime of impulse. It was a crime of domestic normality. Long after the trials ended and the headlines faded, the bedroom at the top of the hill remained one of the most unsettling legacies of Buchenwald, not because of how much was found there, but because of what it revealed about human capacity. The camp itself represented mass death on an industrial scale. It was designed to overwhelm the senses, to shock with numbers so large they blurred into abstraction. But the bedroom stripped that abstraction away. It reduced the Holocaust to a single enclosed space where choices were made slowly, deliberately, and without coercion. No one forced Ilse Koch to decorate her private life with remnants of the dead. That is why the room mattered. For historians, the bedroom became a case study in proximity. It showed how genocide did not only happen in distant offices or faceless bureaucracies, but within homes, within routines. It demonstrated how the boundary between public atrocity and private life could dissolve completely. For survivors, the discovery brought something closer to validation than closure. Many had carried their memories knowing how unbelievable they sounded. Even after liberation, some feared that the world would reject their stories as exaggerations or nightmares born of trauma. The bedroom answered that fear. It told the world that there were horrors too precise to be imagined, too specific to be invented. That what survivors described had roots in physical reality, not metaphor. Yet disbelief never fully vanished. Over time, skeptics seized on uncertainty, on missing objects, on destroyed evidence, on the fact that some items could not be conclusively tested decades later. These doubts, however small, were amplified by those eager to soften history, to reframe cruelty as rumor. The bedroom became contested ground. And that, too, became part of its legacy. Because memory, like justice, is fragile. What the American soldiers found was not preserved in a museum behind glass forever. Much of it was deemed too disturbing to display. Some artifacts were destroyed to prevent misuse. Others disappeared into archives seen only by specialists. The physical room itself changed hands, repurposed, altered by time. But the idea of that bedroom never left. It lingered in testimony transcripts, in grainy photographs, in the pauses survivors took before answering questions, in the discomfort of readers who wished the story were not true, but could not dismiss it. The soldiers who first opened that door had not set out to uncover a symbol. They were clearing a house, securing an area, doing their job. Yet history placed something in their path that forced a reckoning beyond military duty. They learned that day that the worst crimes were not always loud. Sometimes they were curated. The bedroom showed that evil could be organized around taste, around preference, around choice, that it could take pleasure not only in destruction but in possession. And that realization carried a warning forward in time. Because Buchenwald was not an accident. Ilse Koch was not a myth. The bedroom was not a nightmare disconnected from reality. It was the outcome of a system that rewarded dehumanization and normalized domination. The room existed because no one stopped it from existing. That is the truth that unsettles most. What American soldiers discovered in that bedroom was not just evidence of a crime, it was evidence of a mindset. One that did not see human beings as human at all, but as raw material. One that blurred the line between life and object so completely that death became useful. That is why the bedroom still matters. Not because it was the worst atrocity of the Holocaust, there were countless horrors far greater in scale, but because it revealed something quieter and more dangerous, how evil settles into everyday life. how it furnishes itself, how it becomes routine. The Witch of Buchenwald did not need to shout or command armies. Her power lived in comfort, in access, in permission. She operated within a system that rewarded cruelty and shielded those who embraced it. And when that system collapsed, what remained behind told a story no defense could erase. The bedroom exposed the lie that monsters are always obvious. Ilse Koch did not live in darkness. She lived in a well-kept house with clean sheets and decorative objects. She slept peacefully while thousands died below her window. That contradiction is what continues to haunt the story, because it forces us to confront the possibility that evil does not always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it looks organized. Sometimes it looks tasteful. Sometimes it looks ordinary. The soldiers who opened that door carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. Long after the war ended, long after uniforms were folded away, that moment remained fixed in their minds. Not the fighting, not the victories, but the stillness of a room that should not have existed. For the survivors, the bedroom became a grim confirmation that their suffering had been seen, that their stories, once dismissed as too extreme, were rooted in truth. Even so, many of them never found peace. Justice arrived late, imperfect, and incomplete, and memory over time began to fray. That is how history fades, not all at once but piece by piece. Objects disappear. Witnesses pass away. Doubt creeps in. And what was once undeniable becomes controversial, then uncertain, then forgotten. The bedroom of Ilse Koch reminds us how easily that process begins, and how dangerous it is. Because forgetting does not require denial. It only requires distance. The story endures not because of shock value but because of its warning. It tells us that cruelty does not need chaos to thrive. It needs permission, silence, normalization. The slow erosion of empathy until the unthinkable feels acceptable. That bedroom was not built in a vacuum. It was built by a world that allowed it. And the reason the discovery still matters, decades later, is because the conditions that made it possible are not confined to the past. Dehumanization did not die in 1945. It simply learned to change its language. The American soldiers closed the door behind them when they left that house. But history did not close it with them. It remains open, waiting to remind us what happens when power goes unquestioned, when suffering becomes abstract, and when people stop seeing one another as human. That is what they found in the bedroom of the Witch of Buchenwald. Not just objects, but a mirror.